This happened about a month ago, and to be frank, I'm still not fully over it. My name is Noah Reed. I'm 19 and I live in Toronto, but not the city part, more like the outskirts. Far enough from the city that things are quiet, but close enough that you don't feel completely cut off. It was the start of monsoon season at the time, that kind of heavy gray weather where the sky just sits on top of you all day and everything feels damp and slow. My unit exams had just finished 4 days before any of this happened. I was exhausted but relieved, the way you only feel when something you've been stressed about for weeks is finally behind you. I was just starting to enjoy doing nothing when my phone buzzed. It was a text from my college. I opened it and it said academic break, 3 months, due to renovation works. Leaking ceilings, mold, cracked walls, rewiring, sagging floors. The whole building needed serious work and they weren't going to fix it with students inside. So they shut everything down and sent us home. 3 months, just like that. Now for most people that would have been pure relief, and don't get me wrong, part of me felt that too. But there was something sitting in the back of my mind that wouldn't leave me alone. I wanted a PS5. I'd wanted one for a while, but my dad had always had one condition. Do well in your studies first and then we'll talk. So I never pushed it, school always came first. But now exams were done and I had 3 whole months ahead of me, and I started thinking, what if I just earned it myself instead of asking him? I sat with that idea for a day or two, and then I went to my dad and told him I wanted to find a part-time job during the break. Just something to make my own money, stand on my own feet a little. He didn't even pause. He looked at me and smiled and told me he was proud of me for thinking that way and said yes without hesitation. That meant a lot to me, honestly, more than I probably showed. So the next morning I got up with a plan. I wanted something close to home. Flexible hours that wouldn't disrupt my routine, and decent enough pay that I could actually save up in a reasonable amount of time. Gas stations made sense, they're always hiring, the work is straightforward, and the pay is usually fair. The nearest one was only 2.6 kilometers from my house, so I started there. I walked in, introduced myself, asked if they were taking anyone on. The guy looked at me and said no, they were fully staffed. So I kept going. The next option was 6.7 kilometers away, and I'll be honest, when I arrived I noticed straight away it was pretty isolated. Not in a dramatic way, just the kind of place where there's not much around it. Open road on both sides, thick trees sitting behind the building, and a quietness to it that you don't really notice during the day but that you definitely feel at night. I walked in and asked about the job. They were hiring, but the manager told me the only available shift was nights. I told him I'd prefer mornings if possible because of my college schedule, and he thought about it for a moment and then said he could make it work. $22.89 Canadian per hour. I said yes before he even finished the sentence. I worked 16 days straight on morning shifts, and honestly it was one of the smoothest routines I'd ever had. I'd wake up, head to the station in the morning, finish my 3 hours, come back home, spend the rest of the day with friends or just relaxing, eat dinner, and sleep. Clean, simple, and every single day I could feel myself getting closer to that PS5. My dad would ask how it was going, and I'd tell him good, and I genuinely meant it. Everything was fine. Then came day 17. I had some things to sort out at home that morning, some college project stuff that had been sitting on my to-do list, and it ran way longer than I expected. By the time I looked up at the clock, it was already 6:35 in the evening. I had missed my entire morning shift window. I texted the manager to let him know what had happened and apologized, and he replied saying it was fine. Just come in for the evening shift instead to make up the hours. Now here's the thing. I had never worked an evening shift there before. 16 days of mornings, always busy, always people coming in and out, always that familiar daytime energy. But the evening was different. When I arrived, the sun was already low, the road outside was quiet, and the trees behind the station looked darker than I remembered them being. The station felt the same, but also somehow not the same. I told myself I was just being weird about it and settled in to start my shift. By around 10 in the evening, the last few customers had come and gone, and the station had gone completely quiet. That's the thing about late shifts. The daytime energy just disappears, and what's left is silence and fluorescent light and the sound of your own thoughts. The manager came up to me around that time and said he had to step out for about an hour, something he needed to take care of. I told him no problem and he left. And just like that, I was alone. I wasn't scared. Not yet. I just stood behind the counter scrolling through reels on my phone, killing time the way any 19-year-old would. The station hummed quietly around me, and outside the windows the road was dark and empty, and the trees behind the building had disappeared completely into the night. Everything was still. Everything was fine. And then I heard something coming from behind the station, from the trees. It was a deep, low sound, animal-like, the kind of sound that your body reacts to before your brain has even had a chance to process it. It lasted a few seconds and then stopped. I put my phone down and stood completely still, listening. Nothing, just silence again. I told myself it was wildlife, something passing through, completely normal for an area like that, and I went back to scrolling. 9 minutes later, I heard something else. This time it was closer, much closer. It was coming from the back storage room, a scraping sound, slow and deliberate, like something dragging itself across the floor. I put my phone down and just listened for a moment. It kept going. I told myself it was probably a raccoon or a coyote that had somehow gotten in through the back. It happens in areas like that. Animals find their way into places they shouldn't be all the time. I grabbed my phone for the flashlight and walked to the back to check it out. I pushed open the storage room door and swept the light across the room. Everything looked exactly as it should. Shelves lined with supplies, boxes stacked in the corners, equipment sitting where it always sat. Nothing out of place, nothing moved, nothing broken. I stood there for a moment, feeling slightly stupid for getting worked up over nothing. Then I turned to leave, and I heard it again. Except this time it wasn't coming from inside the room. It was coming from the other side of the emergency exit door at the back. Something was right outside that door, pressed up against it almost, because the sound was that close. I stood there for a second, just staring at the door, and then without fully thinking it through, I walked up to it and smacked it hard with my palm, hoping to scare off whatever was out there. The scraping stopped immediately. Silence. I waited. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. Nothing. And then a voice. Deep, but somehow completely calm, like a normal person casually saying 2 words like it was nothing at all. Come here. Everything in my body just stopped. My brain stopped processing. My legs stopped moving. My breathing stopped. Everything just froze for a solid second. And then instinct kicked in, and I looked down at the gap at the bottom of the emergency exit door. Right there on the other side, visible even in the dim light of the storage room, was a shadow. 2 feet. Someone was standing right there on the other side of that door, inches away from me. With nothing but a thin piece of metal between us, something snapped in me and I ran. I didn't grab anything, I didn't think about anything, I just turned and ran straight out of the storage room and through the back corridor into the front of the station. My eyes landed on an iron rod we kept near the counter and I grabbed it without even really deciding to. I just needed something in my hands, something solid, something that made me feel like I wasn't completely defenseless. I pushed through the front door and burst out into the parking lot. Nobody was there. I stood under the harsh white light of the station canopy, gripping that rod with both hands, breathing hard, scanning left and right. The road was empty. The parking lot was empty. I looked toward the back where the emergency exit was. Nothing. No movement, no sound, just the darkness of the tree line sitting there at the edge of the light like a wall. But I knew what I heard. I knew that shadow was real. I knew those 2 feet belonged to a real person who had just spoken to me, and whoever that person was, they were somewhere in that darkness right now, and they could see me perfectly clearly standing under those lights while I could see absolutely nothing. I pulled out my phone and called the police right there in the middle of that parking lot. And then I counted every single second while I waited. 3 minutes and 49 seconds. I know that sounds crazy specific, but I was so scared I needed something to focus on. So I counted. When those police lights pulled into the parking lot, I felt like I could finally breathe for the first time in what felt like forever. I was still standing there gripping that iron rod when the officers got out of the car and walked toward me. They already knew why they were in the area. They told me they had been searching for someone, a man, a drug addict, who had been wandering around that whole stretch of road acting completely erratic. Already tried running from officers once earlier that day. They took my statement, asked me to stay where I was, and headed around the back of the station. They found him in the room right in front of the storage room at the back of the station. To this day, I still don't know how he locked himself in there, but the officers didn't waste any time. They hit that door so hard it came clean off its hinges like it was nothing. The man was crouched behind some bags in the corner trying to hide, and one of the officers grabbed him by his hair and pulled him out. He resisted for just a second before the officer put him down with one punch, and it was over. I stood there watching all of it happen from a distance, and I couldn't speak. Whatever he wanted, whatever his plan was, I don't know, and honestly, I don't want to know. The cops drove me home themselves. I sat in the back of that police car the whole ride, just staring out the window. My mind was completely blank. I didn't say a single word the whole way home. When I got there, the officers came inside and told my dad everything themselves. I just stood there listening to them. After they left, I sat down with my dad and told him the whole thing again, start to finish, everything I felt, everything I heard. He just listened without interrupting once. And when I was done, he didn't say much. He just put his hand on my shoulder. A few days later, a letter showed up at the house. I opened it not knowing what to expect, and inside was a compensation check, 999 Canadian dollars, for the trauma and the bruises from when I ran out of that storage room in a panic. Physically, I felt fine after a day, but that check hit different, like an official acknowledgement that what happened to me was real and that it mattered. My dad and I went back to the gas station together after that. The manager saw us walk in, and the look on his face said everything. He was sorry, actually sorry. He handed me 2,000 Canadian dollars cash on the spot without me even having to ask. After that, my dad drove home and picked up my mom, my little sister, and my older brother, and we all went out for a good long lunch together. Just the family, laughing and eating and being completely normal. And then we went and bought the PS5. I got what I worked for. I earned it myself. But sometimes when I think about it, I freeze for seconds. And every time I thank God that I was safe. I used to work a night job. And I say used to because after what happened, I never went back. Not once. And honestly, nothing in this world could make me. I was in my first year of college at the time, morning lectures every day, and I never really liked asking my dad for money. Not because he wouldn't give it to me, he always would, but there's something about being a grown man in college and still holding your hand out every time you need something that just didn't sit right with me. So instead of going home and asking, I called my friend and told him I was looking for a part-time job, something that wouldn't clash with my mornings. A couple of days later, he called back with two options. One was a position at a local mart, 4 to 5 hours a day, around $12 to $14 an hour. Decent, but nothing special. The other was a night shift at a museum, only 3 hours, starting at 10 in the evening, $18 to $20 an hour because of the night hours, and I'd be done and home by 1 in the morning. I didn't even have to think about it. I called the museum the next day, had my first shift by the end of that week, and for the first 9 days, everything was completely fine. Finish lectures, hang out with friends, eat, head to work, come home, sleep, repeat. It was honestly the perfect setup. I had absolutely no idea what was coming. On the 10th day, something small happened that I almost didn't register. I was doing my usual rounds through the exhibition hall when I noticed one of the statues looked slightly different from how I remembered it. Not dramatically different, just shifted a little, like it had been moved a few inches or was facing a slightly different direction. I stood there staring at it for a moment, then told myself I was just tired and moved on. But it stuck with me enough that I mentioned it to my mom when I got home that night. She just smiled and told me I was overthinking it, that museum staff probably move things around all the time for maintenance or display purposes. That made sense, so I let it go and went to sleep. The next few days were completely normal, nothing out of place, nothing unusual, and I started to forget about it entirely. By day 14, I genuinely thought I'd imagined the whole thing. That's how normal everything felt. I even remember thinking to myself that this was the easiest money I'd ever made. Then on day 15, I took a leave. I had a college project that needed my full attention, so I didn't go in. I came back on the 16th, and that's when I noticed something I had never seen before, a statue standing in one of the halls I walked past every single night. Same stone gray finish, same still posture, just another exhibit. I figured it must have been a new addition that arrived while I was away, so I didn't bother asking anyone and just got on with my work. On the 17th day, I noticed the statue had changed its pose. Not dramatically, just subtle enough that if you weren't paying attention, you'd miss it completely. But I had walked past that thing every single night, and I knew what I saw. The arm that was down at its side was now slightly raised, and the head that was facing forward was now turned just a little to the left. I stood there staring at it for probably a full minute before I went and found my coworker and asked him about it. I described exactly where it was standing and what it looked like. He just looked at me, confused, and said there was no statue like that in that part of the museum. I thought maybe he hadn't noticed it, or maybe he was messing with me, so I just nodded and went back to my rounds. I kept finding reasons to explain it away. Maybe it was a temporary installation. Maybe the display team had rearranged things again. I kept telling myself there had to be a normal explanation because the alternative wasn't something I wanted to think about. The 18th night, I heard noises coming from the locker room. A low shuffling sound at first, and then something that sounded like movement. I told myself it was rats, because that's the kind of thing you tell yourself at 10 at night alone in a museum. I walked over and opened the door, and the second I did, the sound stopped completely. I checked the whole room. No holes in the walls, no gaps under the door, nowhere a rat could have come from or gone to. Just silence, and an empty room staring back at me. The 19th night started completely normal. I finished my rounds and sat down on a bench near the new statue to take a break and scroll through my phone like I always did. After a few minutes, I decided to open Google Lens and point it at the statue just out of curiosity. I wanted to know what it was supposed to represent. I figured it would come up immediately like everything else does. It didn't find anything. No results, no match, nothing. I thought it was just a glitch, so I put my phone down and went back to scrolling reels. About 4 minutes passed, and then something stopped me cold. There in my feed was a video, and in the background of that video, clear as anything, was that exact statue. Same posture, same gray finish, same everything. I sat up and looked at my phone, then looked at the statue, then back at my phone, trying to process what I was seeing. I sent the reel to myself and kept scrolling, trying to calm down. And then about a minute later, I looked up. The statue's eyes had moved. They were looking directly at me. I didn't think. I didn't process. I just ran. I don't even remember making the decision to move. 1 second, I was sitting on that bench, and the next, I was sprinting through the exhibition hall toward the security room. I burst through the door, breathing hard, and told my coworker everything. And he just leaned back in his chair and told me I was making it up to scare him. I told him I wasn't joking and asked him to come with me. He rolled his eyes but got up anyway, and we walked back through the exhibition hall together toward where the statue had been standing. It was gone. Not moved, not shifted, just completely gone. The spot where it had been standing every single night for the past few days was empty. I stood there pointing at the empty space, telling him it was right there. It was right here. And he just looked at me like I had completely lost it. I remembered the reel I had sent to myself and pulled out my phone to show him. I opened my saved videos and found it, but when I clicked on it, the video had been deleted by the owner. Gone, like it never existed. I looked at my coworker and he looked at me, and neither of us said anything for a moment. Then, from across the building, the locker room started making noise again. Not a shuffle this time, not something that could be explained away as rats or pipes or an old building settling. This was banging. Hard, deliberate banging, like something on the other side of that door wanted out. My coworker's face changed completely. Whatever doubt he had about what I'd been telling him, it left his face in that moment. We looked at each other, and without saying a single word, we both turned and walked fast toward the exit. And then we started running. We hit the exit door and it didn't open. Locked. I grabbed the handle and pulled again, thinking maybe it was just stuck, but it wasn't stuck. It was properly locked, and neither of us had the key on us. I looked at my coworker and he looked back at me, and I could see in his eyes that he was just as lost as I was. I asked him where the key was, and he was so frightened he couldn't even think straight. He just kept patting his pockets and shaking his head. And then the lights went out. The whole museum went dark in 1 second, and I mean completely dark, the kind of dark where you genuinely cannot see your hand in front of your face. We were standing there in total silence and total darkness, with whatever was in that locker room still banging on the door somewhere behind us. I pulled out my phone for the flashlight, and without even thinking, I took out my house keys and tried them on the exit door. I know that makes no sense. I know house keys don't open museum exits, but I was not thinking straight. I was running purely on fear. Then I looked at my coworker and said we needed to break the door down. He didn't argue. He didn't hesitate. We stepped back and hit it together, once, twice, 3 times, and on the 3rd hit it gave way and we were out. And I have never felt fresh air hit my face like that before in my life. We ran across the parking lot and I got to my bike, hands still shaking, heart still going 100 miles an hour. I looked over at my coworker and asked if he wanted me to drop him home. He shook his head and said he was staying with me. I don't think either of us wanted to be alone at that moment, so he jumped on the back and we rode. I didn't wear my helmet. I didn't even think about it. I just needed to move, needed to get as far away from that building as possible, and I rode home faster than I ever have in my life. When we got to my house, I rang the bell and my mom opened the door. She took one look at both of us and asked what happened. I told her nothing, just a long night, because my dad was asleep and the last thing I needed was that conversation at midnight. We went up to my room and sat down and just looked at each other for a long moment, and then we both started laughing. Not because it was funny, but because that's what happens when your body has been running on pure fear for the last 20 minutes and suddenly you're sitting in a normal bedroom with normal walls and a normal ceiling, and nothing is trying to get out of a locker room anymore. We sat there until we calmed down, and then my coworker went home and I lay in bed staring at the ceiling for a very long time before sleep came. The next morning I went back to the museum. I know how that sounds, but I needed answers and I needed my payment, so my coworker and I showed up together and asked to speak to the manager. We sat down and told him everything, every single detail, from the statue that moved to the pose change, to the locker room, to the eyes, all of it. He listened with this expression on his face that sat somewhere between patience and skepticism, like he was hearing 2 exhausted kids who had scared themselves silly overnight. Then I remembered Google Lens stores every image you search in your history. I opened my phone, went into my lens history, and there it was. A clear photo of the actual statue, the one I had pointed my camera at the night before while sitting on that bench. The search had found no results, but the image itself was still sitting right there in my history, plain as day. I turned my phone around and showed it to the manager. He stared at it for a long time without saying anything, and I mean a long time. Long enough that the silence started to feel uncomfortable. When he finally looked up, his face had completely changed. Whatever skepticism was there before was gone, replaced by something that looked a lot like genuine shock. He didn't explain what it was or where it came from. He didn't say anything at all about what we might have experienced that night. He processed our payments, added an extra $1,000 on top, and wished us well. We never went back. I've thought about that night a lot since then. I've tried to find logical explanations, I really have. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe someone was hiding in the museum dressed as a statue. Maybe the locker room noise was just the building. Maybe the lights were on a timer. I've run through every possible rational explanation I can think of, and none of them fully hold up. Because a prank doesn't explain why the manager went pale looking at that photo. And a timer doesn't explain why the lights went out at exactly that moment. And a person in a costume doesn't explain how something that size disappeared from a room with no other exits in the time it took me to run to the security room and come back. I searched for that statue online for weeks after. Different search terms, different databases, different museum archives, nothing came up. Whatever it was, it either doesn't exist in any official record or someone made sure it wouldn't be found. The reel that had it in the background never reappeared. The account that posted it was gone within hours of me seeing it. I've checked back more than once. To this day, I don't know what was standing in that museum with me for those 19 nights. I don't know what was in that locker room. I don't know why the manager reacted the way he did or what he knew that he didn't tell us. Some things don't have clean endings. Some things just stay with you, quiet and unresolved, like a statue standing in the corner of a room that you could have sworn wasn't there before.